Is Bitcoin telling us something right now? Because we're starting to see a real weakness now in Bitcoin, but there's a very high correlation between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ. Here's what you need to know before the bell this morning. Markets have been, again, very quietly, very slowly kind of climbing this wall of worry over the last really kind of few weeks. Again, August, September tend to be weaker months. That has not been the case so far. August has turned out to be a pretty decent month return-wise altogether. So nothing's really happening here so much, but we do have these negative divergences that are picking up in both relative strength, momentum, and also in money flows, which money flows remain very, very weak here at this point. So again, there's kind of this underlying weakness in the markets, even though markets are kind of climbing. But at the same time this is happening, we've talked about recently that particularly looking at the NASDAQ index more than anything else, which has been really doing well because of the whole drive to chase technology stocks, and that continues. That's actually weakening now a bit more than the S&P 500 itself. So we're starting to see a little bit of a divergence between this kind of technology proxy and what's happening in the S&P 500 index. Now, stepping back beyond that, we flip over and take a look at Bitcoin as a good example. Is Bitcoin telling us something right now? Because we're starting to see a real weakness now in Bitcoin, but there's a very high correlation between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ. And we talked about that yesterday on our X page on Twitter. I posted a chart of this correlation. We also talked about it in our daily market commentary. But there's a very high correlation because Bitcoin is basically a proxy for risk taking. So if we take a performance chart between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ, it's a very close approximation. But we're now triggering a sell signal on Bitcoin. Bitcoin's actually been declining a bit more than the market itself, and we're starting to get a pretty decent downturn in relative strength. So one of the kind of a leading indicator potentially for the markets can be Bitcoin at this. And so we're kind of watching that closely. It doesn't mean the markets are going to crash. I'm not saying that at all. But we're starting to see this kind of weakness start to show up in the market. So again, that could all just be a kind of a prelude, just people taking profits, kind of rebalancing some risk going into the Jackson Hole symposium, and particularly the speech on Friday. We'll see what happens with Jerome Powell. Maybe expecting that we're going to get a dovish twist. If we don't, markets might sell off a bit. But if Jerome Powell comes out a lot more dovish, we could see this market pick up on some strength here. But again, it's worth at least paying attention to what's kind of going on with some of these correlations, because we are starting to see some weakness. And again, this has really been a market driven by the top 10 stocks really of that index. Again, we go back to talking about the S&P 500 versus the RSP, which is the equal weighted index, which has a very different risk profile right now. While the market's been climbing, relative the RSP, the equal weight index, really hasn't. So when we start to take a look at performance across the market, it's been pretty concentrated. Again, we talked about that kind of in tech and financials. The rest of the market kind of really dragging here along. That kind of bifurcation is also kind of a sign of internal weakness in the market as well. Just worth paying attention to, especially if you've got a lot of excess risk in your portfolio. These things are just a little bit worth paying attention to, because it does suggest we might be setting up, at least here, for a short-term pullback or a consolidation, particularly if there's any type of bad news that pops up that could kind of spook buyers in the market, at least temporarily. So that's what you need to know before the bell this morning.